in space, no one can hear you podcast. This is the No Fear Cast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
And I'm Lisa, and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. We are continuing our summer series, and we are following the biggest science fiction blockbusters in our summer of sci-fi, unofficially called Sci-Fi Harder, with our look into the first two Alien movies. So we're going to be discussing the 1979 Alien film and its sequel, 1986 Aliens. And oh my gosh, Matt, I love these movies so much.
Oh, I do too. And I mean, I know we're just doing the first two, but I mean, I even have a special place in my heart for Alien 3. But after that is when the franchise starts kind of going downhill. But I think I like Alien 3 the most because I saw all three of those Alien movies in the same weekend. So I watched Alien Friday, Alien Saturday, and then Alien 3 on Sunday. So they all three of them are kind of special to me. But yeah, I guess we should probably start with Alien, though, since we're going chronological, right?
Yes. One of the things I love, and I'm going to let my nerd flag fly a little bit right now, but one of the things I love about the original Alien is the backstory of how it got made. And it actually kind of ties in nicely with some of the things we've been talking about, because we talked about Jaws first as kind of the first big summer blockbuster. And we also talked about Terminator and Terminator 2 as summer blockbusters, kind of the science fiction summer blockbusters that we've come to expect. And that led us into the perfect sequel, which made us want to talk about Aliens, because that was another perfect sequel. But one of the things I love about Alien, besides just the movie itself and how great it is everything that led up into making that. Now, I'm going to recommend, I think I've recommended this book before, but there's a book called Shock Value by Jason Zinoman, which it's all about how kind of what we understand as the horror genre in film, how it developed like through the 70s and 80s mainly. And he's got a whole chapter that's basically like dedicated to Alien. And this is just one of these things that I find the story of how it was written fascinating. Matt, do you know much about how the idea came about?
No, I actually don't.
Oh, good. All right. Okay. I love this. So it starts at basically the University of Southern California, and I think it was a film school project. That there was this movie called Dark Star, and I don't know if you've seen it. It came out in 1974, and it's like a science fiction comedy, but it was made by Dan O'Bannon, who went on to be the writer for Alien. So it's kind of his story. He had a friend by the name of John Carpenter, and they made a movie together called Dark Star. And they were kind of talking after they made Dark Star, and they wanted to make, because that's a movie about space and aliens, that they wanted to make another movie inspired by a 1951 film called The Thing from Another World, which is about, and this is a quote from the book, a predatory shape-shifting alien insect found in an archaeological dig. So you can already see like where it's coming about. And well, at the time that they were kind of tossing around this idea, and Dan O'Bannon was formulating the idea that would become Alien, he started to get really sick, and he started to have just debilitating stomach pain, and he was having trouble eating, and he thought that this was going to like derail his career. And it turned out later, he was later diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And which that's the sad part of the story. But what I love about it is he thought that this was going to be the end of his career as a filmmaker, because he was so stressed out. This was before he had a diagnosis, and he was so sick, and he was seeing doctor after doctor, and and getting like needless surgeries and all this stuff that so yeah, so he was thought that this would be the end of his career, but it actually inspired one of his most famous scenes. And I probably don't have to give you two guesses to imagine what that is, because he said it always felt like something was trying to basically like burrow its way out of his body, out of his abdomen. And so that his disease kind of inspired, he thought it was going to derail his career completely. And instead it inspired one of the best scenes in all of horror films, I feel like, which is the chest burster scene. And we will get to that, I'm sure, later. But, so he basically took this film that he had started talking about in film school with John Carpenter, and he turned it into what we now know to be Alien. And he actually, to kind of tie it back to what we started with, he took the script to Steven Spielberg, and showed it to him, and had asked, I think, Spielberg to direct it, and he couldn't because he was working on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But it was Spielberg's kind of his I guess his word to other people in Hollywood. He was like, hey, this is going to be a really big movie. And because Spielberg had made Jaws, people were listening to what he had to say. And so Spielberg kind of in a strange way helped get this movie made. But when they pitched it, and this is what I love, they pitched it as Jaws in space, which I feel like if you're going to take Alien and like simplify it to its core, that's kind of what the movie is, which ties in nicely to our series this summer, I feel like. But anyway, so I'll just leave us there. We have Jaws in space, created by Dan O'Bannon, who I just really respect as being a horror movie person, I guess, a pillar of the horror movie. But he took this script, and together with director Ridley Scott and, of course, H.R. Geiger, very famously designed the creature, they kind of made movie magic a little bit. So I just love the story kind of leading up to it. And I love that John Carpenter, who had kind of been there in the original, he became a huge horror name with Halloween, which came out in 1978. And then his buddy, made Alien in 1979, which were arguably two of the biggest horror movies that came out of that decade. At least the ones that made Hollywood kind of look at them and say, hey, horror can actually make money. It doesn't have to be some kind of schlocky B movie. It can be a big blockbuster. So there's kind of that neat connection. But anyway, I don't want to keep talking. So what do you think about that? Jaws in space.
I was sitting there chewing that over as soon as you said that sort of elevator pitch line of Jaws in space. And I mean, I think you're right when you boil it down to its barest bones of the plot. That is kind of what it is. I was also thinking, because I did not know that it was originally offered to Spielberg. I'm kind of curious as to see what Spielberg would have done with that script. But I mean, Ridley Scott just knocked it out of the park. So I mean, that movie is so good. And but there was a part of me that's wondering now, like, if in an alternate universe, what would the Steven Spielberg directed Alien be like? I mean, the thing about the Alien franchise is, I mean, this movie, I mean, it took so long for there to be a sequel, and I'm not trying to get ahead of ourselves and start talking about Aliens yet, but I mean, it was like, what, a 7-year gap between the sequel, and so it's just really interesting to me that there was a good long period of time where it was just a standalone horror movie, and I think it really does meet the criteria of a very good sci-fi horror movie. And one of my favorite things, I guess, there's two things that I love about Alien. One is the fact that in that infamous chest bursting scene that you mentioned already, that, I mean, if you're not familiar with it, I don't know where you've been, but I do love that bit of trivia that Ridley Scott didn't tell the other actors what exactly was going to happen. They knew something was going to happen in the scene, but they didn't know exactly what. So their reaction to John Hurt having the thing explode out of his chest is pretty real. It's like real shock and oh my god, you know. So I mean that's some method acting right there for you.
Well, so much about like how this film was put together and how it was shot. Just I feel like for anybody who enjoys film, especially horror films, it's so interesting because it's so different, and that's a good example of how it is different. Because I think in the script, it literally just says with that for that scene, like the thing emerges. They were very vague in how they put it on the page because they wanted those reactions to be genuine. And O'Bannon kind of, when he was writing this, took a page right out of like Stephen King's playbook because he thought, you can scare audiences. Like that's one thing that you can do. But a second thing you can do is to really gross them out. And so that's what he wanted to do, where Jaws famously, and we talked about it in our episode and why it works. He kind of took a page out of the Hitchcockian playbook, I guess, where it's like, okay, don't show the monster until really late in the film. Don't let them see everything that you have. Well, in Alien, you see the thing, but that doesn't take away the terror because that fear of the unknown is immediately replaced with this fear of the grotesque and this fear of just an ick, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's body horror at its best, I think, in the sense of like this is literally a thing that attaches itself to your face and shoves something down your throat to lay an egg. It eventually falls off, and then the egg gestates and bursts out of you like that. I mean, just the whole idea is just unsettling. And I mean, I obviously have never had Crohn's disease, but I get, having watched that movie, I get a sense of what it must be like. So sounds absolutely horrible. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of that gross factor, and I think one thing that the movie does so well with the alien, aside from the amazing design by H.R. Geiger, is like you said, you don't see the whole thing. I mean, you see glimpses, and it's hiding in the shadows and stalking. I mean, it's there, but it's not there. They know it's there, and they're trapped in this ship with it, but they don't even know what it is. Or like when they discover that the blood is acid. I mean, that's like, oh well, okay, we can't shoot this thing now, so that's out of the playbook. I mean, it's like the claustrophobia of it, I guess, is what I'm trying to get to. Is as well as only seeing moments of the alien, whereas they're trying to figure out what in the hell is going on.
Right. Well, and I think it, because you're right. I mean, I guess the full alien isn't actually seen until the very end, close to the end of the movie, where you see the full thing. But it's just, I feel like when you see Jaws, you realize there's a shark in the water, and even when you see just glimpses of what it is, your mind kind of fills in the rest of there's a shark there. You can what that looks like. You have something, but with this thing, as it's called a lot in the film, this alien being that they're fighting, even when you do start to see it, your mind can't fill in the gaps of what it truly looks like. And I think that's a whole another level of horror that a lot of these monster movies reach for, but never quite get in the way Alien does.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of wanted to. This might be a good place to bring this up. You had, in our kind of pre-planning show notes, shared a couple of articles, and there's one from the Onion's AV Club that there's a great line in it that I think kind of fits here about Alien, about how this movie is about being forced in an instant to contemplate the idea that there are forces at work in the universe you will never understand, and that these forces will be happy to kill you. And, like, I think that's kind of a great summation of kind of what we've been talking about here, that, like, this alien thing is something that we can't comprehend in the sense, or well, I say we, I mean in particular the actors, but even as viewers, it's so completely unlike any other alien you've seen before. And what's really interesting to me, I would even say, is that throughout this entire franchise, but since 1979, that's a pretty long time, there's never a name given for the species of alien that these are. They're referred to as the alien. They're referred to as xenomorphs, which is just a fancy way of saying it's something from not here, but it's never actually given, like, an actual name as to what kind of species it is. I think that's very telling, because I think it's meant to live outside of what we know and can understand. Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense. And in that kind of way, it almost fits into like this Lovecraftian or cosmic horror genre. Because it's when you realize that, and I don't want to jump ahead into Aliens too much, because this idea becomes really important in the sequel, I think. But it's when you realize that there are things bigger than us, like you said, that want to kill us, and it kind of makes you realize how insignificant we are, really, in the grand scheme of the universe. Especially when you realize that in wanting to kill us, we want to fight back, but there's no real rules in the fighting. It's not like going to war, or it is, as we kind of find out. Again, I don't want to jump into Aliens too much, but Aliens is a different film altogether. You're fighting this thing that doesn't have humanity. And, just taking a moment to kind of ponder what that means, really. The things that we understand as human and what it means to be human, this thing is not that. And that's terrifying in its own way. Yeah.
Well, and what's so interesting, too, about how this is presented to us is, they come across this ancient alien ship that's been crashed on this planet or whatever. But what I love about it is that Ripley and the rest of them they're nobodies. Like, they're literally like space truckers, as I think what a friend of mine once called them. And that's basically what they are. I mean, they go into hyper sleep and go to sleep for, they suspended animation as they're traveling, but they're essentially escorting cargo. So, I mean, these aren't warriors, these aren't scientists, these aren't, people who are going to want to study this thing. These are just everyday people who suddenly come across this crazy ancient race of things that just want to kill us, basically.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Well, and I mean, you went ahead and we need to we can't dance around this much longer, so we need to just go ahead and point out. I mean, the connecting factor besides the alien, the thing that we can't name, this xenomorph, if we, that's the closest thing as you said, we get to a name. The thing that really connects Alien and Aliens, you've got the alien, of course, that connects it, but really it's Ripley that connects those two films, because she is a character in both of them. And just to kind of stop and look at, she's such an iconic character. And she's she is kind of the epitome of the strong female lead that we get in horror movies. And she's different from being a final girl, I feel like. Even though she fits into that category a little bit, but she's not. And this is one thing that I really like about, like, Dan O'Bannon and what he does in the original script. And I know a lot of people say they like the second one better, and I'm just going to go ahead and say that I don't know, I have an affinity for the first. But what I love is how he envisioned her, because he didn't want her to become the final girl and become strong because she was a victim. Like, she pretty much starts out strong. And really, if you look at who the victims are, the men are victimized really first, which is unusual for a horror movie. Usually the women are victimized, and then at least one will become the victor, right? But here the men are victimized, and he was intentional in that because he wanted to make, he was like, if you see a man going through something he's not supposed to, i.e. childbirth, right? Like you said, they are these space huggers that put eggs in you, basically. If you make men see that on film, they're going to experience a type of horror that they've never really had to confront. And I thought, I like that. I like that idea of intentionally flipping the script on some of these horror films. And even we mentioned Halloween coming out the year before. Even kind of taking that and flipping it a little bit and like, okay, we're going to have a strong female character, but let's victimize the males too as we go along, because that's going to make people uncomfortable to see this sort of thing. And that kind of fits with the chest burster scene too, because it had to be a male on the table and not a female, to kind of fit with that aesthetic, I guess. And so yeah, Ripley's a really cool character. And I will say this, I love the way her story arc continues on into the second.
Oh, I agree. Should we go ahead and transition to the second, or?
I feel like we should. I feel like by bringing that up, I inadvertently pushed us right into Aliens.
Well, we can keep talking about Alien as ideas come up for sure, but yeah, let's talk Aliens, because yeah, let's do it.
Well, okay, so yeah, as you mentioned, 7 years later, 1986, Aliens comes out. One really interesting thing is that here you have a new writer and director stepping in, and it kind of cements James Cameron as being the king of sequels. And I've heard a lot of people say, and I'm curious to hear what you think, Matt, that this is not a horror movie and this is not a sci-fi movie, that Aliens belongs in a different genre. Like, even though it has the same main character and it has the same villain, really, that it's a completely different type of movie.
Oh, no, it's totally an action movie, like, without doubt. I mean, it's got sci-fi. It's sci-fi action, in probably a similar vein, and this is probably why they've had crossovers as the Schwarzenegger movie Predator. I mean, that's an action movie with an alien, and although that's far more specifically action movie, I'd say, and Aliens is it crosses sci-fi to action. I don't really think there's much horror to it. I mean, there are tense moments for sure, but it's not horror in the same way as Alien is by any means. I mean, and I think that's what I love about it, is that it's a completely different feel and a completely different type of movie, but they both work so well with this alien character that they've created.
Yeah, well, and I think that's what Cameron realized about sequels, because that's what he did in Terminator 2, is he had to flip the script a bit, and make the bad guy the good guy, and make an even badder guy. So this kind of seems to be what he's really good at with the sequels, is knowing, okay, you've got to keep what people love about the original, but then you've got to make something different with it. Kind of same ingredients but new dish. And that's kind of what he does. Well, that is what he does here. And interestingly enough, I've heard people call this like a Vietnam War allegory, because I think Cameron was working on Rambo First Blood Part 2 at the same time that this was going on. And just kind of the idea of pulling, making a war movie. Obviously, it's a war movie against an alien, but the idea of each side is fighting by completely different rules. and each side doesn't really know what they're fighting exactly. It's just kind of like we're fighting each other now. And I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at the film too, especially if you, like you said, Matt, kind of take it as a sci-fi action film and not a horror sequel.
Yeah, I like that parallel of it as a Vietnam, at least inspired movie. Uh, there's definitely a lot of overlap between it and other Vietnam movies from the 80s of the same, like thematically. I'd say there's a lot of overlap. Um, One of the other things too that I really like about it in terms of themes is, I mean, it's definitely got a very anti-corporate message in the sense that the company that Ripley worked for, um, has now decided that they want to essentially try to harness these aliens as weapons, and it becomes this great allegory for, yeah, you don't try to hold on to that tiger by the tail, like uh, this is a thing beyond your control, and much like in Jurassic Park, life found a way, I suppose. There's lots of unpredictable things, and I mean, I love that theme, that idea that they play with there in terms of, here you are trying to control this new species and use it as essentially a covert weapon type thing, and now you guys don't know what you're doing. It came back and bit you in the butt.
I hadn't really thought about it until you made the parallel to Jurassic Park, but it does kind of share that theme, which I would classify like the Jurassic Park movies as pretty much science fiction action. They certainly fall under blockbuster, summer blockbuster film. But it is that. It is the let's take something we don't understand, let's try to monetize it, and then let's send people in who really don't have a reason to fight, but let's have them fight this war for us to get the, to get the resources we need. Yeah, it did. Anti-corporate, definitely. Anti-war, anti-big greedy government. All of those fit.
Absolutely. And one thing I guess we should probably like clarify, just in case any of you listeners have not actually seen these movies, is that Aliens in the cinematic universe, it takes place about 75 years after the original, something like that.
I
can't
think
remember
that sounds right, because Ripley in the end, and again, we're not spoiling it because it came out in '79. But
this movie's older than me. We can't spoil it.
That's right. Yeah, she locks herself into her deep sleep. I forget what it's called, but she basically like freezes herself in sleep until they find her in the second film, which is a very clever, way. They've already established, as you talked about, if they're the space truckers of this universe, that's how they get around. That's how they take cargo. So it fits with the plot. It isn't any kind of God out of the machine moment. It's, it fits well, but that's how she escapes, basically, is by her and the cat are frozen in deep sleep.
Well, and what I love so much about that conceit is that, because at the end of the first movie, not only does she freeze herself in essentially the escape pod because she's blown up the main ship, but she sets a distress beacon, and her thought is, okay, I'll be in deep sleep for like a couple of weeks, a month or something, before they pick me up. She wasn't expecting that amount of time to pass, but it was a really interesting idea on Cameron's part to say, no, let's jump this thing forward, and 75 years have passed. They didn't get her beacon immediately. She was floating in space, and they finally find her and unfreeze her, and here she is now, in this very similar world, because technology hasn't progressed beyond, it hasn't changed so rapidly that she's completely lost, but at the same time, as a character, she's completely adrift. She all of her friends or family are gone and long dead. And I think it's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, it's a very depressing one.
Well,
um,
yes, but it's also a way for him to kind of start fresh too, with a whole new story of let's progress this 100 years, because I don't know if you caught the detail in Aliens, but the place, the colony that they go to, that was the original planet that Ripley had visited, that had the alien ship. The corporation knew that they were going to be infected by these aliens. That's what they were trying to control. But it's the same planet from the first movie, just 75 years later, and
yeah,
colonized and then decolonized.
right. Yeah, I like that idea because that connects it. The planet connects it, but also the the warning signal, because that is how they're kind of drawn in the beginning of the first one, right? With this like warning call, and is that's right? That was in the first one, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was.
They're
The
bleeding
first
together in my head. Yeah, in the first one, and there was the line about is it like a distress call or is it a warning? And somebody kind of jokes, well, we won't know until it's too late or something. So I'm butchering that badly, but by the end, that kind of becomes foreshadowing for what does happen in Aliens, because she's been out there asleep, sending out a distress call, but then she ends up becoming the warning, basically. Nobody else realizes what they're capable of, but she does, because she literally just fought that battle. I mean, to her, it was yesterday, right? That she just fought this battle, and now she's having to do it all over again. Which, in that way, now that I think about it, it's a lot like Terminator and Terminator 2. I mean, she shares a lot of similarities here with Sarah Connor.
Well, absolutely, and I don't think it's any coincidence that James Cameron wrote both of those scripts. So,
of course.
But I mean, I think Sarah Connor, in the sense of Terminator, which is something we did discuss in our last episode, does have a little bit more of those final girl elements. I don't know that Ripley does. I mean, like you said, she just kind of starts as kick-ass from the beginning, and I mean, she shows pretty quickly in Aliens that she can hold her own along with the Space Marines. I mean, they're all these tough Space Marines, and she's pretty much, able to keep up with them. Maybe not quite as much physically, because they do keep her back, from their initial scouting party, or whatever you want to call it. But, by the end, she's one of the only people that survives.
Well, and her arc is a little bit different, because, as we talked about in our Terminator episode, Sarah Connor's arc is to become that final girl, to become the one who can battle and who can, she's hardened and she can fight, and she's a very different person than who she was at the beginning of Terminator. Ripley, and now I keep wanting to say Ridley. Ripley's story arc is different, because she starts out the warrior, and she does become, by the end of the second movie, she becomes the protective mother. So she almost softens and finds her more nurturing side, which, of course, there's a little girl who was the one left from the colony, and she's there defending her. And this is what I said, one thing I do absolutely love about the sequel is the ending battle, when she's facing off with the queen of the xenomorphs, and basically the whole plot has been that they're using the eggs, they're harvesting the eggs, and this is where this kind of war allegory is really interesting, because this is the closest we get to feeling sorry for the other side, even though there's something we cannot understand because they are just not us. But you basically have one mama who's upset that her eggs are being farmed. And then you have another mother figure in the shape of Ripley, who is now defending this tiny little girl that she's found, kind of in the same way she had the cat at the end of Alien. And it's these two mother figures basically battling it out, who is going to win in protection of their own species. And I like that. I like that kind of arc that she goes through, because she goes, like I said, from being this kind of tough talking warrior to being a little bit more softer and nurturing, but that doesn't destroy her strength at all. She keeps that, which is a really nice thing to see.
Yeah, and to have that kind of balance is so rare, especially in a blockbuster type movie, like a wide release action movie, as opposed to some indie drama or something like that. Yeah, it's great, and sadly, Sigourney Weaver won an Oscar nomination for the role, but she didn't win the Oscar, and I feel like that's kind of a sad thing, because she did such a fantastic job as kind of, well, like you said, being kind of straddling this line between fierce warrior and loving mother figure as well, but without it being hokey or condescending, which is, well, a hard thing to do.
Well, it could have been, it could have been a disaster. I mean, when you think about what was done over the course of these two films, I mean, number one, that they made what was basically Jaws in space and did not make it a hokey B movie is pretty fantastic. That it could be an Oscar-worthy film. That is fantastic, because most of the time when you talk about a monster movie, especially like a creature feature set in space, I mean, you're imagining, something straight out of the 50s with, the big-breasted girl in the hand of the monster. And that didn't, Alien didn't deliver any of those things, which was great. You had a female lead who did not need a male to step in for her and fight her battles. She didn't have to learn that lesson. She already knew it. And like you said, even in the second one, who could go up against the Space Marines, and who could fit that. And again, you didn't have her playing the weak victim, as so many final girls kind of do, before they become the strong ones. There were just so many ways that I feel like this could have gone wrong, either one of these films, and they didn't. And I think that speaks to the strength of, both Dan O'Bannon's ideas going into it, because Cameron kept a lot of those, but also the strengths of like Ridley Scott and James Cameron, and bringing their visions to life, and of course the acting. I mean, I can't imagine anybody other than Sigourney Weaver in this role.
Oh, absolutely not. She defines that role so well that it's, I couldn't even begin to imagine another actress at the time who would be as good as her. Not that there aren't other phenomenal actresses of the time, but just for this particular role. Oh God, I mean, there's so much I love about Aliens.
Right. Yeah. Well.
Can we?
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna go off on a tangent and talk about Hudson, played by Bill Paxton, because he's my favorite character.
Well, thank you.
He's so whiny.
Tangent away.
It's just me making an excuse to say game over. So no, go ahead with what you were going to say.
Well, no, I feel like that's one thing that we haven't even talked about is kind of the humor that's hidden in both of these films. Yeah. No, I mean, talk a little bit more about Hudson, because we do need to.
Well, just the characters in and of themselves, and I mean, yeah, Hudson is great. I mean, Bill Paxton. I mean, come on, it's Bill Paxton. Uh, what I think is really interesting in Aliens too, though, is the Marines themselves all are like they all feel like pretty decent characters. I mean, yes, a lot of them die off pretty quickly in the beginning, but like those that survive to like round two or whatever, there's oh, I'm forgetting her name, the tough as nails, Vasquez, and she's awesome. And then of course there's Hicks, and him and Newt and Ripley are the only survivors, and so um, I don't know where I was going. I kind of just got derailed, and I didn't really have much to follow up with Hudson, and now you've put me on the spot. And,
Well, no, I mean, you didn't know if we're kind of follow it following along with this idea of it's Jaws in space. And I don't mean to harp on that. I just think, we've talked about Jaws, we've talked about Terminator. This feels like, to me, a logical story arc to talk about Alien and Aliens. And one of the things I love about Jaws, and I'm assuming I say we because we talked about it in the podcast, but just this idea that at times it's almost like a buddy comedy, and it doesn't have to be. Like it could just be a straight up, we're fighting a shark. But there's all these other really great elements there. And to me, like you mentioned, like the way Hudson and Vasquez kind of go off of each other. Like there's this one line, I'm looking at it right now, and this is just an example. It could be anything, but Hudson says, "Hey, Vasquez, have you ever been mistaken for a man?" And she says, "No, have you?" I mean, they're just like, this film, I mean, especially to be a sequel, like, it doesn't have to have this good, like, kind of witty banter between the characters, but it does. And that makes it enjoyable. Like, these characters don't have to be as three-dimensional, especially the ones that die off quickly. They don't have to be as three-dimensional as they are. Like, they could just be these stock characters. Like, okay, let's throw in some big burly guys with guns. All right, let's throw some face huggers at them. Good, they're done. But, that's not the way the script is written. These are all well-rounded characters, and you get a sense of all of them. And you get a sense of seeing how they interact with each other, and it's enjoyable to watch. And that alone sets it apart, because it doesn't have to go above and beyond, but it does.
absolutely. And, speaking of characters, one that we haven't really touched on much is the character of Bishop, the android in Aliens, and the other android that we discover as an android in the first Alien movie. And that particular arc over those two movies is really interesting, because the first android was sort of there with the rest of the space truckers, as it were, and they didn't know that he was not human, and they find out that he has basically contacted the company, and they've ordered him essentially to try to bring this alien back with them. And so, at the expense of the rest of the people on the ship's lives, which leads to this like deep-seated mistrust of robots that Ripley has that carries into Aliens. And but Bishop, played by, what's his name? Lance
Right.
Henriksen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's great as portraying this sort of like, I don't know what the word is for how he plays Bishop, but he's kind of unsettling, because he almost just kind of looks like an android, but he ends up kind of sacrificing himself in a way, and that sort of comes full circle, and gives Ripley the idea that, okay, well, maybe not every android's a bad android. This Bishop guy seems like he's all right, even if he is torn in half.
Yeah, I don't know how far we should go into the whole android business, because then I'm afraid we're going to like stray into Prometheus territory, and I don't want to go there. I mean, not that I hated the movie. I have to divorce it from these two movies in order to enjoy it.
I will be absolutely honest. I have actually not seen Prometheus.
Okay,
Believe it or
that gives me good reason not to talk about it.
not. Yes. No spoilers.
I
No
won't
spoilers.
spoil it, but I will just say like that. That's kind of the tenuous connection there is the artificial people.
Okay. Interesting. Now you make me want to go watch this.
That was not my intent.
I mean, I do have the morbid curiosity, but I never saw it in the theaters and just never got around to it because I heard such mixed reviews on it. And yeah, like I said, for me after Alien 3, but for a lot of people after Aliens is kind of when the whole franchise begins sort of a slow downward arc, and Alien Resurrection is certainly the beginning of that, which shall not be included in this podcast, I guess.
Yeah, there's a reason we're stopping at the second one. although we'll admit that the third one is out there. I will admit that.
And again, I do like the third one. I do remember watching it and going, I cannot believe that they killed off everybody but Ripley in the first 5 minutes. But there's a lot about it that is in its own way a completely different movie from Alien and Aliens. So that's part of what I liked about it. But since this is just about the first two, we're kind of closing in on kind of our end of our show. Is there any kind of like final thoughts or anything that we haven't talked about that you want to throw out there?
I will kind of just throw this out, and this isn't my idea. This is something I read in a film critique that I can't remember where now. But kind of in talking about the final, the ending of Aliens, of the sequel, you do have this, it comes down to the battle between the two mothers, and interestingly enough, it ends not really by Ripley killing the other alien, or the mother alien, I guess. She has to get it out of the airlock and basically send it out into space. And it kind of thematically fits. This is the argument that the person was making, that a human could not kill the alien because they're fighting basically on two different levels. Again, it's kind of the idea of it's not just other. It's so other that we can't understand it. Like we use that term a lot, us versus them, and like, the other. But it's always this idea of, well, that's just another human that I'm doing that to. That I'm so focused on our differences that I can't see our similarities. But here you have something that is truly so different from us that we can never really understand. We can't understand its motivations. Like the closest thing we have is when you do have the two mothers fighting, because they're both protecting their own. But other than that, what the alien, that's why I think it's important, as you mentioned, that it's never given a name. Not really. It's always it or them or they, or at times xenomorph, because that's the only time. But even, I think you mentioned that AV Club article, they even say that, the term xenomorph is only thrown out there once or twice. Like it's not even what they're called mainly in the films. It's always just this alien thing. And that's because we will never understand it. We will never understand what that thing thinks or feels or wants or what's motivating it, because it is so different from us. And so I think it's important that at the end of Aliens, even though Ripley's been fighting for survival just like everybody else, she can't really kill the thing, because we can't really kill what we don't understand. So the best that she can do is get it out into space, where space will kill it. If it's floating out there untethered, space will kill it. And so that's kind of the best that she can do. So even though you have this absolute kick-ass warrior female, who can take down just about anything that's thrown at her. She can't destroy this thing. She has to just send it out into space and hope that's enough. Which I think is a really interesting thing, because if you're looking at that as an action film, and in a way, Terminator 2 does the same thing, right? You want to destroy the robots, but at the same time, you know that just by melting one of them, you may not have stopped it. You may not have stopped the technology. And so it's kind of this idea that sometimes there are things bigger than us out there. And again, that fits very thematically with the first one that we talked about. There are things out there that are bigger than us that want to kill us, and we will just never understand it. Like, we're that insignificant in the cosmic idea of the universe. And so, yeah, it ties in, even though it's a very different film, completely different genre, really. It all ties together thematically so nicely. So I'll just say that about my last ending thoughts. And again, I borrowed some of those, so I'll put that out there too. That that's not all my ideas, but yeah, those are final thoughts on Aliens.
Well, I'll just say that I agree with you on that, especially about this unnameable thing that we can't understand its motivations, and doesn't view us as anything but, well, essentially incubators for its young. Like, they literally have no care or compassion for what humans are except as incubators. So, yeah, we'll never understand their motivations, I suppose, and that's a great thing. Like you said, Ripley can't be the one to kill the Queen herself. I think is a really nice metaphor there, like you said. So I'm not going to just sit and rehash everything you've said over the last few minutes, except to say I agree. Well, I guess this is probably a pretty good place to stop, don't you think?
I think so.
All right. Well, once again, thank you for listening, and we'll be back in 2 more weeks with another part of our summer of sci-fi. So thanks for listening, and we will see you then.